The one behavior that makes a man realize he is better off alone. Hello, everyone. I am Miss Anna, and today we are talking about something that I have watched play out more times than I can count. A man who was once fully invested, attentive, present, the kind of man who showed up, who planned things, who made it obvious that being with you mattered to him. And then something shifted, not gradually, not as the result of some dramatic falling out, but quietly, like a door that closes without a sound. He stopped pursuing, stopped initiating, stopped fighting for the relationship. And eventually he stopped wanting to be in it at all. And from the outside, it looks like he gave up, like he got cold, like something was wrong with him. But if you trace it back far enough, you almost always find the same thing at the root. Not a single explosive argument, not an affair, not a fundamental incompatibility. One behavior, repeated until he could not unsee it. Today, we are going to talk about what that behavior is, why it lands the way it does, and what it reveals about the kind of dynamic that quietly convinces a man that solitude is more peaceful than partnership. The behavior is contempt, dressed as communication. I want to be precise about this because contempt is a word that gets used loosely. It does not mean anger. It does not mean frustration. It does not even mean criticism, although criticism can carry it. Contempt is the communication, verbal or nonverbal, that the person in front of you is beneath consideration, that their perspective is not just wrong, but laughable, that their feelings are not just inconvenient, but irrelevant, that who they are at the level of their character is fundamentally inadequate. It shows up in eye rolls timed to land at exactly the moment he is trying to explain himself. In sighs that say without words that having this conversation at all is a burden. In the tone that drops 3 degrees colder the moment he says something she disagrees with. In the summary dismissals he would not understand. That is so typical. Here we go again. It shows up when his accomplishments are met with a fraction of the enthusiasm he is expected to produce for hers. When his struggles are treated as less serious, when his opinion is solicited, and then, upon delivery, quietly set aside, when he notices that the version of him she describes to other people, to her friends, to her family, to strangers at dinner parties, is a slightly diminished version, a little less capable, a little more of a project than a partner. None of these things are screaming. None of them would hold up in a court. Each one individually is small enough to be explained away, but contempt does not need to be loud to do its work. It just needs to be consistent. There are many behaviors that damage relationships: dishonesty, neglect, cruelty. Any one of them can end something that started with genuine feeling. But contempt is different from the others in one very specific way. It attacks identity, not behavior. When someone lies to you, they did a bad thing. When someone neglects you, they made a poor choice. Both of those can, in theory, be changed. The behavior can be corrected. The person does not have to be fundamentally reimagined in order for the relationship to survive. But when someone looks at you with contempt, they are not responding to what you did. They are responding to what they think you are. They are communicating that at some level of their assessment, you do not measure up. Not your action. You and men who are already operating inside a culture that has always tied their worth to their performance are extraordinarily sensitive to this particular message. Not because they are fragile, because they have heard a version of it their entire lives and they know exactly what it means. It means you are not enough. And the first time a man hears that from the person who is supposed to be his partner, his safe place, the one person in his life he believed saw him clearly and chose him anyway, something changes that cannot easily be changed back. It usually does not register as contempt the first time. It registers as a bad mood, a stressful week, a moment of impatience that anyone might have. He gives it room. He adjusts. He does not make it into something bigger than it needs to be. But the body keeps score even when the mind is being generous. He noticed, even if he did not name it, even if he filed it under, she was having a hard day and moved forward without mentioning it. The second time, the filing gets a little harder. The adjustment takes a little more effort. He tells himself the same story, but it lands a little differently now because there is context for it. By the 5th time, or the 10th, or the 30th, he has stopped filing it as an exception. It has become the pattern. And the pattern has become the expectation. And the expectation has changed something fundamental about how he shows up. He stops volunteering his opinions because he has learned what happens to his opinions. He stops sharing his plans because he has learned how his plans are received. He stops bringing his full self into the space because he has learned, through repetition, that his full self is not welcome there. He starts editing himself, pre-filtering, running everything through an internal review process before it leaves his mouth. Not because he wants to, because the cost of arriving unfiltered has become too high. And here is what that process looks like from the outside. He seems distant, hard to reach, like he has gone somewhere and taken part of himself with him. He went somewhere safer, inside himself, where the eye rolls cannot reach. This is the part where the dynamic becomes self-reinforcing in a way that is genuinely difficult to interrupt. He withdraws. She notices the withdrawal. The withdrawal frustrates her because she did not sign up for a partner who is emotionally unavailable, and she expresses that frustration, but the way she expresses it carries the very thing that produced the withdrawal in the first place. The edge, the dismissal, the implication that his emotional unavailability is a character problem, rather than a response to something that happened. And he, receiving that, withdraws further. She pushes harder. He goes quieter. She reads his silence as not caring. He reads her pushing as confirmation that this space is not safe. Round and round, until one of them decides they are done with the ride. Usually, he decides first, not with a speech, not with a confrontation, just with a quiet internal settling, a recognition that the energy required to stay engaged in this dynamic exceeds whatever it is returning to him. And once a man reaches that conclusion, once he has done the math and the math does not work, he becomes very still, not angry, not resentful, just done. The way a fire goes out when there is nothing left to burn. And from that stillness, the idea of being alone starts to look less like a loss and more like a relief. Because alone, nobody rolls their eyes at him. Alone, his opinions do not need to pass inspection. Alone, the version of himself that he has been defending for months can finally rest. I want to slow down here because this is a piece of the story that almost never gets told. When a man reaches this point, when he begins to prefer solitude to the relationship, he is not grieving the loss of the relationship itself. He is grieving the loss of the version of it that he believed he was getting into. He remembers the beginning, when she was interested in his perspective, when his plans were met with enthusiasm rather than logistics concerns, when his presence in the room added something rather than requiring management. He is grieving the partnership he thought he had signed up for, the one where he was respected, where his contributions were seen, where being with her made him feel more like himself rather than less. That man, the one who showed up fully at the beginning, did not go anywhere because he got lazy or checked out or stopped caring. He went somewhere because the environment that produced him stopped existing. And the tragedy, if we want to call it that, is that she is often grieving the same man, wondering where he went, frustrated by his absence, genuinely confused about how the person who used to be so present became someone she can barely reach. She did not see the connection because the contempt did not feel like contempt to her. It felt like honesty, like having standards, like refusing to pretend that things were fine when they were not. That is the gap. She was being honest. He was being erased. And they were both inside the same relationship without being inside the same experience at all. I need to draw this line clearly because it matters. Healthy relationships contain criticism. Two people living in close proximity with high stakes attached to each other's choices and behavior will at some point need to say, "That is not working for me. I need something different. What you did there hurt me. This has to change." That is criticism. It is about behavior. It is specific. It has a forward motion to it. The implicit message is, "I am telling you this because I believe you can do differently and because I want this to work." Contempt is not criticism. Contempt is not about behavior. It is about character. It does not have a forward motion. The implicit message is not that things can be different. It is that the person in front of you is simply at some fundamental level not quite up to standard. You can hear the difference if you listen for it. Criticism sounds like, "When you made that decision without talking to me first, I felt left out, and I need us to communicate better about big choices." Contempt sounds like, "You never think before you act. You just do whatever you want without considering anyone else." That is so typical of you. Criticism opens a conversation. Contempt closes a person. And the man on the receiving end of contempt, even if he cannot name what he is experiencing, feels the closing. He feels himself contracting, making himself smaller, trying to take up less space, so there is less of him available to be found inadequate. A man who has been making himself smaller for long enough eventually asks a very reasonable question. What am I even doing here? Here is something that does not get enough honest discussion. Men and women tend to experience love differently, not because one is more capable of it than the other, but because the primary emotional language is different. For many women, the central question in a relationship is, am I loved? Am I chosen? Am I the person he comes back to at the end of the day because he genuinely wants to be here? For many men, the central question is different. It is, am I respected? Does she see what I bring? Does she think I am capable? Does she believe in me? These are not the same question, and confusing them produces a very specific kind of relational failure. A woman can love a man deeply, genuinely, with her whole heart, while simultaneously communicating contempt. She is not withholding love. She has simply not recognized that, to him, the contempt cancels the love out, that he cannot receive the warmth while the dismissal is also present, that the two things cannot coexist in his experience the way they might in hers. She says, "But I love you. I chose you. I am here." He hears, "I love you, but I do not respect you. I chose you, but I think less of you than you deserve. I am here, but not for you entirely, just for the version of you I am willing to tolerate." And love without respect for a man is not enough to stay for. It is not enough to keep fighting for. It is not enough to make the vulnerability of partnership feel worth the cost. He would rather be alone and respected by himself than partnered and quietly reduced by someone else. That is not arrogance. That is self-preservation. I want to be fair here because the women who end up in this pattern did not usually set out to produce it. It tends to start with disappointment. She had an image of who her partner would be, and somewhere along the way, she began to notice the gap between the image and the reality. Maybe he is not as ambitious as she expected. Maybe he handles stress in a way she finds frustrating. Maybe the small things she assumed would change did not change, and the accumulation of small things started to feel like evidence of something larger. And her frustration, which is real and not illegitimate, began to leak, not always in words, in tone, in expression, in the quality of attention she brought to his moments versus hers. He noticed, he adjusted, he tried to close the gap she was signaling. But trying from a place of already feeling inadequate does not produce a man's best work. It produces anxious, approval-seeking behavior that, paradoxically, tends to generate more frustration rather than less. She becomes more disappointed. He becomes more anxious. She expresses more contempt. He withdraws further. And what started as a small disappointment about a specific behavior has, through repetition and misattribution, become a fundamental dynamic between two people who both genuinely wish things were different. Neither of them planned to end up here, but here is where the unexamined pattern brought them. There is usually a specific moment, even if he cannot always identify it precisely afterward, where the decision crystallizes. It is not always a big moment. Sometimes it is very quiet. He says something about his day, or about a plan he has, or about something that is bothering him, and she responds in the way she has been responding for months. The dismissal, the flicker of something in her expression that says, "This again, you again, your small concerns again." And he hears it differently this time, not with hurt. Not with the familiar scramble to repair, just with a clarity that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at the surface. He thinks, "I am more at peace on a Tuesday morning sitting alone with my coffee than I am in this room with her." He thinks, "The version of myself that I like best does not exist in this relationship anymore." He thinks, "I have been trying to earn something here that I should not have to earn from a partner." And with that recognition, the calculus completes. Solitude is not the absence of something good. It is the presence of something he has been missing for a long time. The permission to simply be who he is without it being submitted to a review he never asked for. I think we underestimate what solitude offers a man who has been living under sustained contempt. In solitude, his decisions belong to him. His plans are evaluated by his own standards and found acceptable or not based on his own assessment. He does not have to pass anything through someone else's filter before he is permitted to feel good about it. In solitude, his emotions have room. He does not have to pre-edit his reactions or manage how his feelings will land. He can be frustrated without it becoming evidence of his inadequacy. He can be uncertain without it being used against him. In solitude, the silence is neutral. It does not carry the particular weight of someone who is present but withholding warmth. It is just quiet. And quiet, it turns out, is deeply restoring for a man who has been managing the ambient temperature of someone else's disappointment for an extended period. And perhaps most importantly, in solitude, he can remember who he was before the relationship started editing him. The man who had opinions and expressed them without checking first, who made plans and felt good about them, who existed in his own skin without constantly monitoring how that existence was being received. He is not running away from intimacy. He is running toward himself. And the fact that himself and the relationship have become mutually exclusive is the thing worth paying attention to. If any part of this landed close, I want to speak to that directly. Recognizing this pattern in yourself does not make you a bad person. It makes you someone who developed a habit that was probably not even conscious, that grew out of real disappointment or unmet expectations or a communication style that was never examined carefully enough. But recognition is the only place change starts. And the change, if it is going to happen, has to go deeper than behavior modification. It cannot just be, I will stop rolling my eyes. It has to be, I am going to look honestly at what I actually think of this person and whether it matches what I am communicating I want from him. Because here is the truth that contempt reveals, whether we want it to or not. You cannot sustain contempt for someone you genuinely respect. The contempt is information. It is telling you something about the gap between who you thought you were partnering with and who you believe you actually ended up with. And if that gap is real, the honest conversation is not about managing your tone. It is about whether this is actually the partnership either of you should be in. A man who is genuinely wrong for you does not need to be contempted into leaving. He deserves a direct conversation. And you deserve a partnership in which respect is not something you have to work to manufacture. But if the gap is not real, if the contempt grew out of habits rather than genuine incompatibility, then the work is to dismantle those habits with the same honesty and intention that you would want him to bring to anything you asked him to change. If you are a man who has been living inside this dynamic, I want to say something to you carefully. The withdrawal that felt like self-protection was understandable. What you were protecting yourself from was real. The impulse to go quiet, to stop offering yourself fully to a space that kept returning diminished versions of you, that was a reasonable response to an unreasonable sustained experience. But the silence also has a cost, not to her. To you, a man who has learned to operate with large parts of himself offline, who has trained himself to pre-filter and self-edit and manage his presence carefully, does not easily remember how to turn those systems off. He carries the habit into the next situation, into the next relationship, if there is one, into friendships, into professional spaces. The armor that protected him in one environment becomes something he cannot easily remove in any environment. The preference for solitude, which started as a relief, can harden into an aversion to intimacy that was never actually the goal. The goal was not to be alone. The goal was to be seen, to be with someone who found his presence valuable rather than burdensome, to exist in a partnership where being fully himself was welcomed rather than managed. That partnership exists. It requires someone who leads with respect rather than leading with the gap between expectation and reality. Someone who can disagree without dismissing, who can be frustrated without being contemptuous, who understands that a man's willingness to be present and vulnerable is not a given, that it was extended as a form of trust, and that what it needs in return is not perfection but basic regard. You are not better off alone, because solitude is the superior condition. You are better off alone than you were in a relationship built on something that looked like love but functioned like erosion. That is not the same thing as being better off alone forever. Here is where I want to land. The behavior that drives a man towards solitude is contempt. But underneath the contempt is almost always unspoken disappointment. And underneath the disappointment is almost always an expectation that was never made explicit. She expected someone who would grow in a particular direction. He grew in a different one. She expected ambition to look a certain way. His ambition looked different. She expected the early version to persist. Life applied pressure and something shifted. None of these disappointments required contempt as the response. They could have become conversations, renegotiations, honest reckonings with the difference between the person she wanted and the person she actually has, and what she wants to do with that information. Contempt is what happens when disappointment does not find a productive outlet. When the gap between expectation and reality goes unaddressed long enough to curdle into something that leaks out sideways. The antidote is not lowering standards. It is raising honesty, being direct about what is not working instead of communicating it through the slow accumulation of small dismissals, saying, I am not happy with this specific thing and I need it to change, rather than allowing the unhappiness to settle into a general low-grade judgment of who he is. That kind of honesty is harder than contempt. It requires vulnerability. It requires acknowledging that you have needs and that meeting them is a joint project rather than a test you are silently scoring. But it is the only version of honesty that gives a relationship a real chance. Contempt does not give the relationship a chance. It just gives one person a way to feel justified on the way out. I want to close with this. The men who choose solitude after a relationship like this are not broken. They are not commitment phobic. They are not emotionally unavailable in some innate, unchangeable way. They are men who made a very rational assessment based on the data they were given. The data said, this space costs more than it returns. This person sees less in me than I know I am. Being here requires me to be less than I am, and I would rather be fully myself somewhere quiet than a reduced version of myself somewhere loud. You cannot argue with that math. You can only change the variables. And for the women in the room, I want to offer this without judgment. The contempt that pushed him away may have felt like honesty. It may have felt like refusing to settle or pretend. It may have felt entirely justified given the specific frustrations of a specific relationship, but contempt is the one behavior that, once it becomes the pattern, does not leave room for anything else to grow. It does not correct the behavior it is aimed at. It does not close the gap it is responding to. It simply communicates over and over in the clearest possible language. I think less of you than you deserve. And a man who hears that message clearly enough for long enough will eventually believe it is the truth. Not about himself, about the relationship. And he will leave. Not with a dramatic exit, just with a quiet decision that the door out of the relationship leads somewhere more spacious than the room he has been standing in. I am Miss Anna. If this reached you, let it do its work. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I will see you in the next one.